to our Snedden guest lecture this evening with Matthew McGrath. My name is Rob Prince. I am chair of the journalism department, and want to welcome you to this lecture made possible by the Snedden endowment that we have here in the journalism department, which was created by Helen Snedden, wife of former Newsminer owner C.W. Snedden. And this endowment allows us to bring in really talented, established journalists from around the country and now around the world with Matthew to come in for a year-long fellowship, or we have several guests during the year too. And so our Snedden chair this year happens to be Richard Murphy, a very talented photographer and photo editor. And Matthew McGrath is our guest for this week. So we're very thankful to the Snedden family for making this possible. I'd also like to thank the Snedden committee, which consists of Virginia Farmier and Fuller Cowell, Kent Sturgis. I'd like to thank Dean Sherman as well, and my colleagues Charles Mason and Brian O'Donoghue, who also serve on that committee. One quick announcement before we get started. We have an event coming up in the journalism department here in November. Some of you might be familiar with the storytelling program I put on called Dark Winter Nights, True Stories from Alaska. Our next live event is going to be Saturday, November 21st. That is the Saturday before Thanksgiving. It's at 7 o'clock p.m. in Herring Auditorium. And we have an exciting addition to this year's show, in that it's going to be broadcast live on KUAC FM. So we hope you'll still come if you're in the area. But for those maybe people you know who aren't in the Fairbanks area, they can listen on 89.9 FM, or streaming as well for anyone who's got an internet connection. So we hope that we'll see you November 21st for what I'm hoping will be our biggest event yet.
And what is it going to be? It's the storytelling?
Yes, it's True Stories from Alaska. So we take people generally from the Fairbanks area, and when we can, wider Alaska, put them up on stage, Alaskans telling true stories that happened to them here in Alaska. And we created it because we're frustrated with how a lot of Alaska is depicted in reality TV. And we thought if people want to know what Alaska is really like, it should be Alaskans sharing those true stories with them. So there's more information at darkwinternights.com if you want to look up our podcast. But please mark in your calendars November 21st for that. So let me introduce Matthew McGrath. He's been with the BBC for 20 years, and right now he works as their environment correspondent. He was an MIT Knight Fellow in 2010 and 2011, and he also spent the first 6 months of this year at Stanford, and he makes it to the U.S. as much as he possibly can. He's also the first international broadcast journalist and science writer that we've had as part of our STEM endowment, and we've had over a dozen Pulitzer Prize winners as a part of this, so we're very happy and proud to add Matthew McGrath to the list of highly talented and established journalists that we've been able to bring along. So please welcome Matthew McGrath.
Thank you very much, Bob. Well, hello everybody, and thank you very much for coming out this evening. And I don't know what you're going on about talented and experienced. I suppose if you survive long enough in this game, you end up as being called like that. But thank you very much for welcoming me here, and I'm glad to have been able to bring a little bit of sunshine into your lives, quite literally. The weather, I gather, in the last week or so has been quite bad, but I've managed to bring a little bit of that warmth, hopefully, to you. I want to talk to you a little bit tonight about, I'll talk a little bit about myself and the kind of job I do, and I'll talk a little bit about climate change and the political process to agree a new political deal for the world that's taking place at the moment and is hoping to culminate here in Paris in about 6 weeks' time. I've entitled my talk on Can Paris Save Alaska and the Rest of the World? It's meant to be slightly provocative, obviously, not just Paris, not just Alaska. And I really, this picture of Paris that I'm showing you here, I really like it. It brings back my kind of bittersweet relationship with France and the French. I took this picture last year on a really day that shows kind of climate change in action in some respects. It was very, very high ozone levels here in Paris that day. And it was also the day that the sweet part of this for me was that Ireland beat France in the rugby, which was an amazing and rare thing to happen. The bitter part was that I just bought 30 euros worth of metro tickets to cover my whole weekend travel. And then the French authorities said, well, because of the ozone, we're going to make the metro free for the weekend. So, so if anybody wants some second-hand euro or some second-hand metro tickets, speak to me afterwards. So anyway, Paris is a big deal. I think in some respects it's likely to be the biggest, most significant event in global terms, I think, since Bretton Woods at the end of the Second World War. It's the first time we're going to get 196 countries likely to agree a new way of doing things going forward, a new model, if you like, for development, a new model for economic growth, a new model for how humans interact with the environment, with the world. It really is a big deal. And it does promise a dramatic mix of science, art, diplomacy, and, of course, it being Paris, you might expect a little bit of that. Now, I will get to that in a few minutes, so bear with me as to see what the impact of romance on this great process might be, but I think if we were calling it a movie, would we call it Missions Impossible? I don't know. Is Tom Cruise free? I don't know. Anyway, this is me, and this is where I come from. I hope you can see that there. It's Tipperary in Ireland, place known for its kind of 40 shades of green, 50 shades of grey, and maybe 100 shades of alcoholic. I don't know. It's a beautiful part of Ireland. I encourage you all to come there. The economy needs visitors. It's really rather, old, ancient kind of place. Farmland. I grew up on a farm. And in farms all over Ireland, you'll find things like this, which is hanging in my father's barn. And this is a large picture of Jesus, as you can see. And I guess it kind of shows in some respects the contradictions of Ireland in some ways, that this was a picture that used to hang in a church nearby. It was painted by a local nun, but nobody really liked it that much. So nobody wanted to throw it away. Nobody wanted to destroy it, obviously. So my dad says, I know, I'll put it in the barn. And so the pigeons have a great view of it every day, and they come and look at it, and you can see they spend a lot of time there, adoring it as well. And it's going to stay there, and I don't know what we're going to do with this in the future. I mean, we still haven't solved this particular problem, Anyway, this is my father. He's Tom McGrath. He's 82 years of age. He's a hardworking, he used to be a dairy farmer, and then he was a beef farmer. Now he kind of has a few cattle, so he does a little bit of that. And I really like this photo because he's really relaxed in it, and you can see he's just kind of sleeping there. And I also like the fact that he's in his mucky pants. He's got his trousers, which is just fresh from being out on the farm. And if my mother knew that I was going around the world showing pictures of my father in his manure-stained trousers, she might be a little bit upset. Well, I'm giving you a little bit of my background, basically where I come from, and that's where I grew up, and that's my parents are still living there, and it's really a good place. Now, one of the things I like to collect is nice stories about the United States and the UK and how we differ and the things that we have in common. And this was a story we ran over the weekend as the New York Jets flew to London to play American football, as we call it, football as you call it. And the most important thing that they brought with them was toilet paper, because apparently the British paper was very thin. Well, I can assure you, I can report from the front lines that it's not that thin. It's fine. However, it did the trick for the New York Jets, and they actually won their game. If you contrast this story from the New York Jets with the wonderfully named Atlanta Falcons, who last year flew to London with 3 planes to bring all their fans and supporters there, but you notice where they put London is actually on the east coast of Spain. So two people separated by a common language and a distinct lack of understanding of geography, I think is something we have to bear in mind. Okay. So I work for the BBC, and so this is the building that I work in. It's called New Broadcasting House. This piece of it here on the left was designed by Eric Gill in the 20s and 30s. It's got a sweep around on it, and this blue bit you see in the middle has been added on in the last number of years. 6,000 journalists work in this building. It's one of the biggest broadcasting centers in the concentrated places in the world. It looks really nice from there. Of course, we decided in our wisdom to put all our studios underground and not up on the roof, but that wasn't my decision, so nothing to do with me. It's got a great history. The older part of the building was bombed by the Germans during the war. 7 people were killed. And it happened during a news bulletin, and there's a very famous recording of the bomb going off in the background, while the newsreader, as you might expect, kept going, continued to broadcast. So it's a very place redolent of history, and it's part of, I guess, it's part of the fabric of Britain, and in some respects part of the fabric of the world as well, because the BBC is a very important news organisation for the world, and we do take that job quite seriously. As I said, we have moved into this new building. It's got lots of new technology, and we are trying to find our way forward in how we become digital journalists, how we broadcast in this new way. Technology plays a major part in it. We don't, for instance, use that white aerial on the front anymore. That's just there for show right now. It's not really in use. But I said that we use a lot of technology and technology heavy, and sorry, let me just go back there one. I just skipped through my slide a little bit too quickly. Last year, 2 years ago, I broadcast. I went to Japan to cover an event by the IPCC, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and I ended up doing 17 or 18 broadcasts for radio and TV from there, using nothing more than my iPhone. There was just me, my iPhone, and a conference going on behind me, and a little bit of Wi-Fi. And I think you can kind of see from. I'll just show you to you. You can get a sense of what that kind of thing is like to do.
Well, we can now speak to Matt McGrath, who's in Yokohama, Japan for us. Matt, as you were saying, this is being described as the most sobering report yet on climate change, and yet it's not all doom and gloom. There are some practical steps being recommended in this report that governments can take.
Yes, absolutely. It's in a sense a report that faces both ways at the same time. It's perhaps the most alarming report we've had yet about the impacts. But I suppose it's alarming because it's so clear about what things are going to happen to food, to fish, to humans as well.
To food, to fish, to humans. When you're concentrating on trying to be broadcast live, and you've got an earpiece in your ear, and there's somebody talking to you, and you're wondering if this tripod in front of you, which is really flimsy, is going to fall over, and the whole thing's going to go to a pot, you end up saying things like, to food, to fish, to humans. This is one of my favorite sayings. It ranks up there with another one of my malapropisms, which was I once described that it was a story about nuclear energy, and I said the nuclear chickens were coming home to roost. Believe you me, nobody wants nuclear chickens coming home to roost. It's not a very good thing. I'm going to talk a little bit about the science of climate change. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the process rather than the science. I just wanted to skip through it a little bit to give you kind of, guys, a sense of how we, where the consensus picture is at this moment in time. This is a kind of a graph that kind of shows a little bit in upsum where we are, this global temperature anomaly that we've been seeing for the last 50 years or so. We've got this is a trace of global temperatures from about the end of the last ice age, about 11,000 years ago. And you can see they've gone up, but they've been mainly steady at around this kind of 12, 13, 14 degree level. But in the last piece of time, you can see that the anomaly, the variation from the norm has started to go up quite considerably. And right now, at this moment in time, we're above the 0.8. We're actually just at 1 degree above the long-term trend between 1850 and now. And that's going to be quite an interesting thing, because we all talk about 2 degrees being the safe or the limit of warming that we can allow to happen before dangerous things start to happen. So we can see that we're getting ever closer to that kind of perspective. This is just something from this summer showing you the kind of widespread impacts that climate temperatures are having. We're seeing a big mix of things happening all over here. Obviously you had wildfires here in Alaska, but you had big drought in many parts of the United States as well. That was replicated in Australia, where it was very, very hot. It was well above the average temperature. It was also in Europe, but I noticed that the United Kingdom was slightly cooler than average, which says it all about British summers, which tend to be very wet and soggy. But I guess the point is that what scientists would say is that what we're seeing with this particular temperature set at the moment is we're seeing increasing impacts throughout the planet, and at this moment in time we don't see any kind of change to them. This is the kind of projection for Alaska. If we continue with very high emissions of carbon dioxide, you can see by 2070 to 2090 we're talking about quite a significant rise across the whole state. Lower emissions mean you can see actually here quite a clear difference between what things will mean for the state in terms of a high emission scenario versus a low emission scenario. It's quite distinct on this particular impact. So we're talking about the long road to Paris and how we get there and what we're going to do when we get there. Everything started in 1992 when the UN convened put together the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was signed in the wonderful city of Rio. 190 plus countries have signed this convention, and the key thing it mentioned in the text of it was that it would look to stop dangerous human interference with the climate system. And another thing that's in that text, which is kind of important, is that despite scientific uncertainty. So people often criticize the science and say the science isn't clear or the science is confused, but you got to understand that the negotiators, the teams from all the countries, they're operating with the kind of view that we can't really wait until that absolute certainty is there. We have got to go on our best guess, and the best guess from the climate scientists is that things are happening, the world is warming, carbon dioxide is responsible, and humans are responsible for that amount of carbon dioxide. It set in train in 1992 a process to develop a new global treaty, and they did, and they succeeded here in Kyoto in Japan in 1997. They put together a global treaty that was meant to limit emissions of carbon dioxide and to limit temperature rises. But it had one big flaw, and this is something that is now being tried to rectify. If we look at this slide here, we can see that it's a representation of the countries that all signed the Kyoto Protocol, but only the ones in yellow and green had any obligations under it. The United States didn't sign or ratify it, neither did Australia until quite late on. All the other countries like India, China, all of Africa had no obligations under it. They weren't obliged to do anything to their system. And it set up this very divided world where you had a small group of rich countries at the top and a lot of other developing countries, including countries like Singapore, whose average per capita income is higher than Germany's. You set up these crazy kind of distinctions between countries that countries were very keen to keep, as you can imagine, because it obliged not very many of them to do much. The richer countries, on the other hand, were very annoyed with this, and they festered away on this for 20 years. And ultimately, they decided, look, we can't do this. We can't continue with doing this, and we want to change that. And that process started in 2007 in a place called Bali. And the thing I like about this whole process, this whole story, is the fact that it's really quite dramatic. You know, it's real seat of the pants stuff in terms of diplomacy. You've got 196 countries sitting down to negotiate, and everybody's equal. Everybody's vote counts, and it has to be consensus. And so it sets up these really quite dramatic scenarios. In 2007, this happened in Bali in 2007. This is a little scene from a CNN report on the thing, and I think it speaks for itself about the level of drama that was seen at that particular point.
Secretariat, and I would like to ask apologies from the Secretariat.
It was this blunt request from China that caused such drama here in Bali.
Oh, sorry.
Two meetings carrying on simultaneously.
The Secretariat was not aware that parallel meetings were taking place and was not aware that text was being negotiated elsewhere.
But he was overcome with exhaustion and emotion and left in tears. And then this bombshell from the United States.
I have to say that, the formulation that has been put forward, we cannot accept.
Thank you. Thank you, United States.
The US was booed as it asked for more commitments from developing countries, provoking this from Papua New Guinea.
And there's an old saying, if you're not willing to lead, then get out of the way. And I would ask the United States, we ask for your leadership. We seek your leadership. But if for some reason you're not willing to lead, leave it to the rest of us. Please get out of the way.
And then this total change from the United States.
That we will go forward and join consensus in this today.
Been a day of high drama in this room here in Bali, but finally there is a deal. And many are praising the contribution of Papua New Guinea, whose withering criticism of the US apparently led to a 180-degree U-turn.
That was a very dramatic day. I was there, and it was a really intense experience to see all these people. I mean, Eva de Boer breaking down in tears and crying, and It was just really, really dramatic. And it led to the idea that maybe the world could do something about this problem. And they set up a process that would end in Copenhagen in 2009 with the idea that we would sign a deal there. But unfortunately, that didn't quite work out as people had hoped. So it was Copenhagen, and it was dubbed Hopenhagen, or Dopenhagen perhaps, because people came there and it didn't really work very well. President Obama flew in, all the leaders, global leaders flew in, and they just couldn't make it happen. I was there, and I remember seeing President Obama going past with the phalanx of officials and security around him, and a look of thunder on his face as as his great speeches ran into the reality of trying to convince countries to do things they just didn't want to do. And ultimately, you had a small group of countries, including the United States, the UK, and several others, trying to impose a deal on everybody. And the world, quite literally, wouldn't wear it. And it broke down. This is a behind-the-scenes scenario, a picture from just before everything fell apart. And you can see the grim faces there. They know that things aren't going to go well, and they know that things aren't going well, and they won't be able to do something about it. 2009. This is in Copenhagen, yeah. While those guys are doing that, some other people were doing other things. Here's a little video of something else that was going on in Copenhagen. See if you could spot anybody you might
For many years it was
be familiar with.
forbidden to take a swim. It was very polluted. I think in 2002 was the first time we could open a harbor bath here.
We're a group of people who really enjoy swimming, and today the water is such great quality in Copenhagen that it's possible to swim in the harbor. And I think it's fantastic, a place that used to be an industrial area.
Who is the idiot on the end?
It's only possible because the city has...
So that was one of the things that I ended up doing there, and I was completely bamboozled into doing it. I had no idea that I was going to do it when I got there, and then I was presented with but all these people are going to jump in with you. And I had no choice. And it was extremely cold, and it was like the middle of December, and it was not a particularly nice thing to do. But, it was one of the things that you end up doing as a journalist. So between 2009 and now, things have changed. A number of things have changed completely. And one of the things that's changed is the relationship between the US and China. Mr. Xi, who is a he, ended up in Washington recently, and China and the United States have reached a rapprochement on climate change. It's one of the few things they actually agree on. And they both see it in their interest to strike a deal in Paris. They believe that it will be the best thing for both of them. Other things that are motivating them here are the dirty air. The issue of air quality has really become a massive problem in China. The Chinese recognize they have to tackle this. They have to tackle it quickly. They're moving as many coal-fired stations away from Beijing as possible. They recognize that if it becomes something that disturbs the population, then you could have a real revolt on their hands. But at the same time, as in Paris and in other cases, other cities, air pollution is a real problem. And while it's not necessarily directly connected to climate change, it is a part of that whole conundrum of climate change, and people see it as a motivating factor. There are other factors here as well which are really important in what's changed between 2009 and now. One of them is the cost of renewable technology. If you look at the price of solar power per watt in 1975, it was $101. In 2015, it's 61 cents. It's in 2009, they thought it would come down to this sort of price by 2030, and it's come down in 6 years to this price. So it's really achieved a kind of a major leap forward. That's really, it's really giving great hope that renewables can make a major difference in global power sources. 2014 was the first year that emissions decoupled from growth. But that's a little bit of a funny figure, because is that a recession, or is that a global recession, or is that because people are not using as much carbon dioxide as they were? I think it's a little bit of both. We've had the kind of moral intervention from the Pope, arguing very strongly that carbon dioxide should be restricted, and that there should be a global agreement. And we have people on the streets. We had a huge climate march last year in New York City and all over the world. There's going to be another one just before the Paris meeting. And these guys are, I have to say, they're really well organized. They're able to get hundreds of thousands of people out on this around the world, and they know how to make an impact. And that does get attention, and it does engage people, and it's all a reason to believe that action is likely to follow. But of course, it's not necessarily that simple. One of the things I seem to have gone into a bit of a repeat mode here. Let me see if I can get past that. Or if I'm stuck in a loop somewhere. Okay, getting back to Paris. The likelihood of it, there is likelihood there's going to be a deal, and it's going to likely comprise of a number of different factors. The most important of which is they will likely put down on paper for the first time a long-term decarbonisation goal. And this is likely to take the form of either setting 2 degrees as a target beyond which global temperature shouldn't rise, or to say that by 2050 the world should be on a path away from using fossil fuels. It should be decarbonising. They will definitely agree that every country will undertake appropriate actions. That means everybody's got to take some part of the burden, even the developing countries, or a lot of the developing countries. And for the poorer countries to adapt, there will be a lot of money. But the most important element of a deal that comes out of Paris, if it doesn't have a review mechanism, then it won't really be a strong deal. And the idea is that a review mechanism looks at what everybody's pledged every 5 years and says, okay, how are we doing? How does this add up against our target? How does that add up against our 2-degree goal? That will be a key element that's likely to come out of it. And all those things are likely to be agreed in one form or another. But it's not just that simple. There are a number of problems, because if you look at the things that can cause problems are some of the things that actually guarantee success, like China. China is when it comes to Washington, it likes to play part of the G2, the very rich countries. We're a real powerful country. When it goes to the UN, it likes to pretend that it's still a developing country, because in many ways it is a developing country, and it likes to side with the developing countries. So China's really got to make its mind up. Is it a country is it an emerged country, or is it still a developing country? You've got the likes of India as well, who are keen to sign a deal as long as there's a huge pot of money. They put a price on what their climate change adaptation cost would be last week, $2.5 trillion, and they want everybody else to pay that to them to make that happen. So there's going to be some real hard bargaining to make a deal. And I haven't even mentioned Saudi Arabia, who are implacably opposed to any restrictions on the use of fossil fuels. One of the things that I think could actually make a big difference in making everything fall apart in Paris are these two. This is the French Foreign Minister, Laurent Fabius, and this is the French Ecology Minister, Ségolène Royal. And you can see from their body language there, they're not exactly the best of chums, okay? And there's a very good reason for that. They have a lot of history. They both tried to become the nominee from their party to run for president in 2007, and Fabius looked like he was going to get it, but Royal stole it, and she ran for president and didn't win. But she's also married, or was married to, or partnered with this guy, François Hollande, the president of France. She's in fact the mother of his 4 kids. She has also been appointed, they have lunch every week, you know. So you've got the Paris talks being chaired by her, being run by him, our sworn enemy, with the president of France, who desperately wants a deal because his presidency is turning very, very sour, in the middle between them. So it's a real ménage à trois, to coin a French phrase. And I think that's one of the reasons that the whole thing could fall apart, because of a kind of an internal power struggle. It was one of the factors in 2009 that really caused a rift and difficulties for people. Poor Francois. A picture of him on a bicycle, he must regret ever having that taken, I guess, I think. There's one other thing that could also make a big difference as well here, which is slightly more serious, which is it's a question called loss and damage. And this is not just about money for countries that suffer from climate change. It's not about money to help countries to mitigate or cut back their emissions. It's not about helping them to adapt. This is an issue about what happens to countries when they suffer overwhelming devastation from a climate event that they then seek to link to emissions caused by the United States, Europe, Germany, Japan, the richer countries, over a long period of time. Now, this was Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines in 2013. It caused, you can see from the GIF here, it just went right into the places you just don't want it to go. And it caused an absolute swathe of devastation. It did hundreds of millions of dollars of damage. It cost thousands of people their lives and their homes. It left the place in an absolute state. And the Philippines, they're saying quite clearly they want this issue to be front and central of any part of a Paris deal. The big problem for that is that the richer countries see this as putting a legal obligation on them, a kind of like an insurance policy, that you are responsible legally for putting all these emissions in the air, and therefore if a storm happens in 20 years' time in some small country, you're legally responsible to pay for that. And the United States, Europe, and the other countries, the developed countries, will not wear that under any shape or form. So that's one of the key things. It depends on how, everybody believes that everybody can be mollified with money. Like if you give, here's $100 million, little country, just go away and don't make a fuss. But the principle here is the key thing. It's the argument over the principle, and this could be something that really sinks the whole thing. The other thing that could make it all difficult is time. They've got like 2 weeks of negotiations. They've just finally got a draft piece of paper together that is 20 pages long. They could run out of time because in these events, the UN has control of this piece of land in Paris for 2 weeks. After that, they have to take it down. Everybody's got to go home. Their flights are booked. You're going to have 50,000 people in France. 50,000 people there. If it drags on a day or two afterwards, that's probably fine. But if it's going to last any longer, somebody at some point is going to have to say, "I'm sorry, we got to get out of here. We got a lingerie show coming in or whatever it might be. We've got this, we can't stay in the space any longer," and somebody will have to call it. And that's one of the key questions about it. So what does it mean for Alaska and the rest of the world? It's very difficult to know. It could mean a range of different things. I think it will mean a significant change in the way that people do business over a long period of time. I think businesses are very keen, and the bigger businesses in the world, they're keen to get a signal. They're keen to get an investment signal as to whether or not the investments that they have in fossil fuels are safe, or good, or valuable. And there's a long question mark over that if a new deal is done. And I think it's going to make countries transition from fossil fuel usage. It's going to accelerate that process away from the use of fossil fuels to the use of renewables. I'm just make a point about the United Kingdom. Coal was such a big thing. It was almost the equivalent of oil in Alaska in the 1960s. You had 1,300 mines in the UK. The vast majority of the UK's electricity power in the 1960s came from coal and nuclear, but mainly coal until then. Now, there's no mines. There are no mines. All the mines are closed. And yesterday, the British government said that by 2023, you wouldn't be allowed to generate electricity from coal unless you had some sort of carbon capture device or you had some other way of doing it. So essentially, they've moved in 50 years, or they're moving in 50 years from an economy that was powered essentially by coal to one that by 2023 will no longer be. So I think, if you look at Alaska, maybe it might be able to take a leaf out of some of those books in terms of making those kind of changes. I want to kind of be slightly controversial and say, if the Paris Agreement comes together, success will have many fathers. If it doesn't, no one will take the blame. And every politician in the world will want to fly to Paris and have his picture taken with the new agreement, and it's all down to me or whatever. I think there's one guy who could probably, I will argue, should be there, could be there, but probably won't be there and won't get any thanks. And it's this guy. You might have seen him before. Not necessarily known as the greatest fan of climate change or making negotiations happen, but President Bush came up with a principle that's actually allowed this whole process to move forward. Because as I mentioned before, in Copenhagen and Bali, the whole thing got stuck on this idea that the UN and the rich countries are going to tell everybody else what to do. And in 2008, Bush argued forcefully, very forcefully in fact, that it had to be from the bottom up. Countries had to come to the United Nations and say, this is what we can do. This is what we are aiming to do. And after the failure of Copenhagen, the United Nations went back and said, actually, you know what? We think we should try that. And so last week, 140 nations had put forward their plans on how they're going to tackle climate change. Their intended nationally determined contributions, nationally determined, their own plans. And if you add all those plans up, you get a world that will warm by 2.7 degrees. But that is pretty big progress from 2009 when there was no plan and the world was heading for a 6-degree rise in temperature on the base. Now when I say 6 degrees, I'm talking Celsius. That's a lot more in Fahrenheit. Don't ask me to work it out. I haven't a clue. But the Bush idea that everybody would put on the table what they could do and then people would review it over a number of years is actually in many ways, the bedrock of this particular agreement. Now, I don't think that he's going to be flying to Paris himself to take the plaudits if it works. I don't think that there'll be too many people mentioning it there, but it is actually factually true. And so I think, we have to realize that in journalism and in science and in climate change and lots of different things, often the answers that we need are not the ones that come from the sources that we would necessarily want them to come from. Anyway, I thought I'd just finish my remarks there and be open to take questions from you. My thanks to the Snedden Foundation for the Department of Journalism at the university. Thank you very much for having me here, and thank you very much all of you for coming along and being here tonight. So, thank you.
All right, are there any questions?
I just heard on the radio this afternoon that planting trees, there's about half the amount of trees now that there was maybe 5,000 years ago. And that would be one of the methods to capture the carbon. Has that been proposed or
Yeah.
thought about?
If you look at most of the countries, the poorer countries who have put forward plans how to deal with climate change, planting trees is the big one they go for. So the Chinese have put forward a plan, to plant hundreds of millions of trees. Indonesia the same. Indonesia is interesting. They're cutting them down faster rate than they can plant them, but it's a big plank, if I can pun, of most countries' plans to deal with it, particularly if they're poor. And I think, it's a...
Deforestation in Brazil has slowed down, I think.
It has.
Still going pretty strong.
It's still going pretty strong, but they planned now to end deforestation by 2030. That's their commitment, that by 2030 there would be no further deforestation than what we've got at the moment, I suppose. So I think it's everybody recognizes the value of trees and they recognize it as a cheap solution. But it all gets more difficult as a world with 7 billion people now, 9 billion people by 2050. They all have to be fed. Are we going to get into a conflict then about land for food, land for trees? How do we balance those things? That's one of the things that they would hope to possibly thrash out there. Sure.
Comment on the question. It's a comment. You showed the last picture, George Bush.
Yeah.
I think Al Gore is probably the one that I would bring up much more than George Bush there. But talking about climate change deniers, there are some lobbies that are denying climate change. We have them in Alaska as well on campus. Could you speak a little about climate change deniers and how that has interfered with your reporting?
Sure.
And the feedback you get?
I work for the BBC, and we have a strong code of impartiality. When we come to reporting climate change, we represent the majority of the views of scientists. That doesn't mean we exclude the views of people who are skeptical about it. I think what's interesting is that there's a kind of a rainbow, if you like, of belief about climate change and the impacts of it and how it all works. And there are people, out and out deniers, people who refuse to see any link between the use of carbon dioxide and temperature rises. But if you speak, there's a lot of other people in the middle who are, I wouldn't say in the middle, but they're to one side, who are skeptical. And what they're skeptical about is not necessarily the link between carbon dioxide and temperatures, but it's the scale of that effect. And this is where some of the battle lies. It's what's termed about the climate sensitivity. How sensitive is our climate system to the amounts of carbon that we're putting into it? And even Nigel Lawson, he's a former Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK. He leads a big foundation, the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which are seen and usually described as deniers or climate skeptics. But they put out a report last year saying climate warming is happening. They just disagree about the scale of it and the level of it. So, we report those guys. We tend not to report the guys who are, completely denying it, and we report the mainstream view. And we try and report the conflicts within science as well as but we get a lot of what you might term criticism from there are people who are very active on social media, and as you might imagine, there's a lot of people who are skeptical of the process, skeptical of the science, who use those processes and use those media to have a go at us, basically. So that makes it kind of difficult. Not impossible, but difficult.
My understanding is that in the U.S., the number of journalists covering the environment has been declining. And first of all, I'd be interested in your comments on that and why, and if the same is true in the UK.
Yeah, I think the number of specialist journalists, not just environment, has been hit in not just environment, but in health reporting, in science reporting, in defense reporting. All those specialisms have been hit, I think, in most countries. And I think that's been a factor of economics and a factor of the recession. And I think, it's been seen as a luxury, I think. I don't know if it's the same here, but I think in Europe you could argue that a lot of news organizations have seen the idea of having specialist journalists as a luxury. And the BBC still has lots of specialist journalists, health reporters, defense reporters, and thankfully environment reporters as well. And I don't know how that's going to play out in the future, to be honest with you. I think there is a tendency to reduce the people who are relative experts in their field. But against that, when you have something like this come along, which is going to be a very big story, we're going to be broadcasting this for like 2.5, almost 3 weeks, pretty much non-stop. It's going to be a major part of our news coverage for that time. It'll be the biggest news story we have this year, probably, in terms of length and duration. And they need specialist correspondents to do that. So I don't know. I don't know what the future is for specialist correspondents. I just know that we've been under a lot of pressure and being cut back a lot, and I hope that stops, basically.
With regard to the United States specifically, our further right, our Republican Party in particular, is known for, if not outright denial, then extreme amounts of skepticism. With that in mind, do you have any particular fears regarding their influence if they are voted into power, and similarly, do you think the world community?
Yeah, I don't have a dog in that fight. It's not down to me, and I don't have a view on that. I guess what you're kind of asking is, if Obama signs a deal in Paris, will President Trump, for instance, revoke it, or some other Republican if they become elected? And I think that's a very good and important question. And I think all the countries are cognizant of that. What they're trying to do, in some ways, is they're trying to engineer the way. They're still arguing over what the legal form of this document will be, if it is. But one of the theories is that since everybody signed and ratified, including the United States, the UN Framework Convention back in 1992, if this is a part or a further part of that, then it doesn't necessarily need to be reapproved by the United States or by any of the bodies. Now, it would need to be ratified because it may be a protocol or another legal form that's added to that. But everybody wants the United States to be part of this. Perhaps, maybe not the Republican Party, but it's very difficult. If President Obama signs something and then another president comes in, will they renege on an international commitment that the world is seen to agree on? I don't know. I mean, President Obama as legislator, or he's used his executive powers here to put forward the Clean Power Act. He's doing that, and that will still needs to be tested by the courts, and it needs to be, and we'll see how that survives another president as well. It may not have to be. It may not have to be. I think that's one of the things that's unclear. I mean, it's very unclear at the moment. They've got a 20-page document, and they want it to be a legally binding document, but how that becomes legally binding. Is it the targets become legally binding, or is it the process by which you put forward a target that becomes legally binding? So this is where you get very expensive lawyers in a room for like days on end, charging huge amounts of money to put this all together. So I don't know. We'll have to see about that. But I think they want to try and engineer it so that nobody who goes into it can back out that easily. Yeah.
It was nice to hear the word impartial and reporting in the same sentence, because we don't always have that in America. Can you talk a little about the structure of BBC, how you're funded, how do you maintain that impartiality?
Yeah.
The ethics of it?
Yeah, several people have asked me that since I've been here the last couple of days. So the BBC is funded by what's called the license fee in the United Kingdom, which is it's £140 at the moment, £145, and it is everybody who uses a TV set or a radio has to pay it. It's obligatory. It's a criminal offence at this moment in time not to pay it, and for how they do, they take people to court and say, you didn't pay your license fee, bam, you can go to jail if you don't do it, which is a slightly ridiculous situation. What's even worse for BBC staff is if I don't pay my license fee, I get sacked. It's one of the few sackable offences in the BBC. So I try to make sure that we pay it. That pays for 6 TV stations, 6 radio stations, a whole bunch of online stuff, all the programs that we make and sell to the rest of the world. And it's, in my opinion, cheap compared to sports services that I pay for. I pay like £1,200 a year for sports channels that I subscribe to versus £140 for the BBC. I mean, what can you do? That's how we're funded in the UK, but in the rest of the world we're funded by advertising model where our external BBC World presence sells adverts online and for the TV stations as well. And it's a complicated mix of the public funding and the private funding from the commercial funding that doesn't always sit brilliantly together, I have to be honest. But that's the way things are in the world. It works mostly, and one of the things that people have remarked on here is that the popularity of Top Gear, the TV program. I don't know how many fans of Top Gear are here. It's a motoring show that's very, very popular, and we sell that in 160 countries around the world, and it makes about $50 million a year for the BBC. So it's a very, very big source of revenue for us, and that's one of the things that that program's now kind of changed considerably in the UK. But when I arrived into Seattle the other day, the immigration officer asked me what I was doing, where I was from. I said, probably rather pompously, well, I'm from the BBC and I'm here to do something. He said, what about Top Gear? So that has the kind of widespread popular, I suppose, understanding that you. So you asked me about the impartiality. How do we maintain the impartiality? We don't have direct pressures like I suppose journalists here do. In a sense, not all journalists obviously, but some where there's a direct connection between the sales of the paper, the stories that are in the paper, and the sales of the plain survival. We still get paid. We still get our money, even if the story isn't. So it allows us to be, I suppose, less commercial in the stories that we choose, and we are, we have a commitment to being impartial. That's part of what we do, and it's really, really important. It's part of our ethics. I was in a class with Rob the other day, and I had my pass in my pocket. This is my BBC staff and pass, and on the back of it, just in case I forget, has got all the BBC values, of which trust is the foundation of the BBC. We're independent, impartial, and honest. So it says it right there at the top. So when I'm in doubt, I check my pass. No, it's not tax money. No, but it's a license fee. It's termed a license fee, yeah. And it's a hard-won settlement. It's a hard-won settlement. They're trying to change the situation so that people don't go to jail for paying it, and that may well be the case.
Just a quick follow-up
Sure.
on the BBC News, BBC World. You used to have a fabulous daily free little email message you sent out, and then they quit, and they said they were restructuring it. And I have to say, until I noticed that you were coming to town from the BBC, I didn't really miss it, because you know how it is when you get on email. But what are they doing for an online presence? And are they doing 10 stories a month free, or will they do the daily email breaking news type thing?
I don't know what they're going to do with that, but they're really, they're really committed to trying to move into the digital world. That this is a big challenge for all news organizations, and to try and how do we use Facebook, how do we use Twitter, how do we use the social media applications that are out there to generate the news. And actually my girlfriend works on some of those issues she's very concerned about putting out an email daily from the program that she works on to subscribers around the world. So people are working on things like that, and I will pass on the thought that BBC World's email is missed.
Use your influence.
I'll do what I can.
With everything you hear about the world being upset with the United States imposing stuff on everybody else and being in control, why do they want the United States to lead this whole thing, and how are they going to enforce anything?
Yeah, the enforcement's a really good question, and it's something that's exercised the United States a lot over the last few years. It's in this process, it's called MRV. It's measurement, reporting, and verification, and it's been a big thing. How do we know that China is living up to its deal when it says it's cutting its emissions? It's a really important aspect of it. I think the United States, over the last 7 or 8 years, I think all the other countries want the United States in it because the United States is, the United States is the United States. It's not a world deal without the United States. It's still the most important player there, technology-wise, finance-wise. It's the number 2 emitter in terms of carbon. So you can't have a global deal without the United States. It's just won't fly. And everybody wants that. I think every country there wants that. And the US, for their part, want to ensure that they get a deal that's watertight. They don't want people promising things that they can't live up to. And this is why this whole part of it is measurement, reporting, and verification. They've made a lot of progress on that, and they've put in place some very strict measurements of how this is going to be measured and reported and verified to put that in place. But all those things still need to be taken from what's been agreed, written into a document, everybody's got to sign it. So there'll be as many a slip between the cup and the lip, so that's still in play. But people recognize it as one of the key things for the United States. President Obama cannot sign a deal that goes back to the United States and says, well, it's leaky and it's got lots of holes in it, and China can do what they want, India can do what they want. I don't think he could make that fly. So I think he's going to push really hard for that.
What gives you hope in this rather complicated process?
What? Sorry?
What gives you hope in this?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I think the people there are so bored of each other. They've been in it so long. They'd sign anything to get out of it now. They're going to lock them up in Paris. When I say Paris, it's not actually Paris. It's Le Bourget, which is a kind of an airport in a pretty ugly suburb of Paris, and they're going to lock 50,000 people up there for 2 weeks, and say to them, "Okay, guys, come to a deal or what else." What gives me hope? I think there's a lot of things that changed. A lot of things have changed. The cost of renewables has come down. People are taking the long-term view. Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, she's working really hard behind the scenes. She's twisting a lot of arms. She's got the Brazilians and the Indians into kind of to come on board with lots of things that they don't necessarily want to come on board with. It could still all fall down. That's the thing. It's complicated. The thing they've got to do is get 196 countries all to say yes at the same time. And it's huge, and it's not like a majority voting. Everybody's got the same say, and everybody's got to agree. And I was in. There are pre-meetings every month or so. There's one coming up in 2 weeks' time, and there was one last month. And I was at that one, and basically they sat around for a week and did nothing. All the negotiators did nothing, and they came out with an 83-page text. They've now cut that 83 pages down to 20 pages, which is major progress. But they've just basically hived off loads of stuff, so that it doesn't say anything about aviation anymore. It doesn't say anything about forestry anymore. It doesn't say anything about shipping anymore. So they're trying to boil down to the common denominators that everybody can agree on. And if they get a long-term global goal, i.e. a decarbonization goal that we're going to give up fossil fuels by 2050, if they get a ratcheting up mechanism and they get agreement on money for poorer countries, I think most people there would say that's probably as much as we can get right now, let's sign that. They could have probably got that in 2009, but the politics wasn't there. The politics are different now. I think, I do think the French actually can probably move that along if they don't end up falling out amongst themselves. But I suppose that gives me hope, really.
China's looking at their pollution just to keep their population healthy, is what I think.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. The human health aspect of this is a real driver for the Chinese. Yeah, absolutely. The Chinese have invested hugely, like in solar energy. That they in the last couple of years, they have now more solar energy capacity than the United States. The problem with it is they can't connect it to the grid. About 30% of it goes missing. It's just their wind turbines are twisting in the air and generating power, but the power's not going anywhere. So they have major problems in terms of reforms, electricity market reforms, building a grid, building all that capacity. They really want to do it mainly for the human health impacts and the impacts on the political control aspects, I suppose.
India's got the same problem.
India does have the same problem, yeah, and they do, and they're investing heavily in the in solar as well, and they see that as a major solution for them. But they want to lead the developing world. China's moved out of the way as far as they're concerned. China and the US are over here being buddies. India now sees itself as the leader of the developing world, and they're pretty aggressive in their negotiation style. They could really be one of the reasons this whole thing could fall down.
But at the same time, they don't want to act too quickly because of the economy.
Yeah, that's right. But they've already got in place. They already put a tax on every ton of coal that's consumed in India and produced there as well. So they have some plans and they have some ideas to take it forward. Sorry.
So
Sure.
With this conference and the reporting, how do you recommend that we follow it and not just totally get lost in the forest?
Yeah, I'm hoping I don't get lost in the forest as well, because it's really complicated. I would say what you should do for the 2 weeks is just consume BBC products all the time. Okay, that will guarantee that you don't have any problems with understanding it, and we would hope so. I think everybody recognizes this is a big deal, and everybody will try and cover it. It's really hard to know how best to consume it and how to approach it. Sorry?
Do you Twitter
Yes, I do. Yeah, we do everything all at the same time. Twitter, one-man band. I do that as well. It's very complicated. I don't know what the best thing to do, but I would say, all the major news sources, the New York Times, everybody else, they will cover it in depth as well, and they'll all do, pretty much a straight up reporting on it.
All right, because I owe Lisa.
yeah, we all owe Lisa.
So my question is, what are you most looking forward to reporting at this event?
That's a really good question. So I'm not looking forward to reporting well, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because in some respects, it's a more dramatic story if the whole thing falls down. Right. Yeah. No, but it is. It's like, oh my gosh, the level of interest. What I'd like to report most, I think, would be if the Pope comes to Paris. I think that would be a great part of the story. And in fact, if you read my columns the last couple of weeks, I've been trying to put that out there as a question that people have been asking me. Actually, they haven't. I've been making it up myself and saying the Pope should come to Paris. I think that would really make a really dramatic aspect to the story. But yeah, I think in some respects, the failure would be terrible for the planet, but good for the journalists.
Okay, one final question.
Okay, so, first of all, how many of our students are still here?
Okay.
Now, Matt, so one thing.
Sure.
We've just finished this, they're from Modern World History class. People today, the world is healthier and wealthier than ever before. Certainly since 1800. Far wealthier and healthier than ever before.
It's not true.
Was that true? Well, you can take my class.
Yeah.
But anyway, so overall.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, so one of the problems as a reporter, there's a book, really great book called How the News Makes Us Dumb. I'm not saying that you do.
I do my part.
Or the journalism part. But there sometimes is a difficulty with short and long range issues and perspectives, and that is something. So I'm just talking to my class here, and the rest of you, I won't bother you with this. I'm not saying to you, but this is my class. So, this is a really important sort of example of the byproduct of the commercial, industrial, liberal revolution of the last 200 years, this issue of global warming.
Yeah,
so
sure.
I want to tell them that. And the other thing is, I want to ask you, when has the United States ever done anything the UN told it to do? Because I can't think of a single thing.
Well, I think, the people talk about the Montreal Protocol that dealt with ozone as a way, that was a UN-led, and the United States took part in that. And, that is not an ideal model for climate change, but it's good on the basis that it dealt with the problem. And
but
the United
States... This means something the United States doesn't want to do. I mean, the UN is incredibly unpopular in the United States. That's
sure.
one of the difficulties here, besides the lack of belief in global warming.
Yeah,
so we have a dual problem.
two big problems there.
Yes,
yeah.
but this was a very interesting thing. I hate to hijack your thing, but I
No.
have to get that in because my students were leaving.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Matthew.
Cheers. Thank you very much.